From Vermont Public, this is The Frequency. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. It's Tuesday, January 30th, and here are today's headlines. Hearing all the raindrops this month, you might be forgiven for forgetting that it's winter. Rain on snow weather events are becoming more common. That's when temperatures hover near the threshold between precipitation falling as rain or snow. And when it falls as rain, snowpack melts. Dartmouth geography professor John Macon says these events are slowly changing how winter looks.
But it's not as simple as just, the first snowfall is coming a few weeks later. It's more complicated because we're seeing increasingly events where you'll have rapid melt owing to both warm temperatures and rain falling on that snow in the middle of winter.
Year-round, the Northeast has seen the number of days with 2 inches or more of rain jump by half, and days with 5 inches of rain or more have increased by more than 100%. Macon says some of this activity can be attributed to human-caused climate change. The U.S. government has voiced concern about a new Quebec law requiring businesses to have their signs written predominantly in French. The Office of the United States Trade Representative says it met with Canadian officials to register, quote, concerns about the policy's impact on American businesses. That's according to the CBC. The rule requires non-French signs to be accompanied by French descriptions that are twice the size. It's part of a larger push to encourage the use of French in Quebec. The provincial government says the signage law will cost businesses between $7 million to $15 million. But the CBC reports the costs could run much higher, especially for chain stores with multiple locations. One of Vermont's best-known journalists is retiring. Reporter and anchor Stuart Ledbetter is stepping away after a 40-year career in Vermont, that according to NBC5, which made the announcement yesterday. Ledbetter was best known for his political reporting. He hosted the weekly news roundtable program Vermont This Week from 2007 to 2023, and was inducted into the Vermont Association of Broadcasters Hall of Fame in 2019. Ledbetter attended the University of Vermont and joined NBC5 in 1984. His last scheduled broadcast is Friday, February 16th. The number of Americans struggling with rent payments has reached a record high. That's according to a new report out from Harvard University. It shows that emerging from the first years of the pandemic, a record half of all U.S. renters spent more than 30% of their income on housing. Chris Herbert is with the Joint Center for Housing Studies, which published the report.
Housing markets were extremely tight. Demand was rising rapidly, and the result was an incredible increase in rents, which has pushed the number of renters who are paying excessive amounts of their income for housing to a record high, and also pushed the number of people experiencing homelessness to a record high.
The report notes that low housing stock nationally is playing a role in driving up costs. And coming up, Vermont is familiar with the problem of low housing stock and rising rents, both of which can lead to people being left with no place to live. Now, 2 statewide organizations devoted to housing advocacy are teaming up to tackle homelessness in Vermont. We'll get the details after this.
Support for The Frequency comes from the Vermont Department of Liquor and Lottery, who manages Vermont's 802 Spirits liquor stores and contributes 100% of profits to the general fund, providing over $300 million to help benefit local communities.
2 of Vermont's statewide housing advocacy organizations recently joined forces. The Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition and the Vermont Coalition to End Homelessness have merged and reformed as the Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont. Frank Kanak is the inaugural executive director. He sat down with Vermont Public's Jen Jarecki to talk about addressing Vermont's homelessness crisis, as well as his path to this work, which started with skateboarding.
Tell us more about HHAV's 2 parent organizations and why they decided to merge.
Our predecessor organizations, Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition and the Vermont Coalition to End Homelessness, had been around for a long time, and they've been working really closely together because obviously the issues between access to housing and combating homelessness are really tied to the same fundamental problems around not having enough units, around not addressing temporary shelter needs that may exist. Now we're able to kind of think bigger, to engage in strategic planning, to envision a future that tackles both of those issues without having to silo anything off. So we're really excited about that opportunity.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your connection to Vermont?
So yeah, I grew up in Manchester in southern Vermont, and it was kind of there where my interest in this work really began. I was grew up as a skateboard kid, and so had a lot of negative interactions with law enforcement for no other reason that we were just skateboarding. And it really piqued my interest in civil rights work and human rights work. That led me to Cairo, Egypt, to study international human rights law. But I knew I wanted to come back and work in the U.S. And so when I came back to the U.S. in about 2005, I ended up getting a position with the ACLU. But a lot of that work, I was dealing with issues that are the repercussions of the failure to provide adequate housing. So a lot of issues that have to do with the criminalization of poverty, with funding court systems off the backs of the poor, with using bail laws to basically be able to sweep up whole communities of unhoused people and hold them in jails instead of actually providing housing. And so as I dug deeper and deeper into that work, I realized that we were just working on the Band-Aid issues. So when this opportunity in my home state of Vermont arose to actually be able to tackle these issues, these core issues, and the intersecting issues around substance use and mental health, I was so excited that I have this opportunity now to work with our board and staff and really lead this work going forward in Vermont.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned some of your other work around the country. I know that it dealt with the damaging ripple effects of mass incarceration in our communities. How do you see that thread woven within the fabric of housing insecurity and homelessness here in Vermont?
Vermont's made tremendous progress over the last few years, particularly with the influx of money that came in through COVID to really try and tackle the issues of expanding, the number of housing units available, expanding the wraparound services that people may need so that they can stay in their housing, and expanding access to temporary shelter. But at the same time, we still look at and have, debates around really regressive policies for drug policy, for example, using the criminal legal system as an appropriate solution to people with substance use disorder, or to not provide adequate mental health treatment. And so that folks with mental health crises are instead too often funneled into our criminal legal system, with unhoused people, using the criminal legal system as the tool to, clear encampments, to criminalize people sleeping in certain spaces, etc. Those are all highly inappropriate and highly ineffective ways to deal with, the failure of our state and our communities to provide adequate housing. And so I think what we need to do is kind of take a step back, stop looking through the lens of rhetoric, start looking through the lens of data, and recognize that if we really want to create safer and more just communities for all, that we need to ensure the basic services for all.
The stated mission of HHAV is to make homelessness and housing insecurity, quote, brief, rare, and non-recurring. But less than a month ago, Vermont Public reported that Vermont has the second highest per capita rate of homelessness of any state in America, for the second year in a row, at an 18% increase compared to the year prior. I mean, how do we get from here to there?
That report also showed that we were also housing, I think, one of the highest rates of people per capita. So I think it shows two things. It shows that Vermont really cares and is trying to do the right thing, but we still have a lot of work to do. And I'm really optimistic, actually. We've been doing a lot of work at the legislature this year, the hotel and motel program that's been utilized during the pandemic to ensure that folks have access to housing. There's been concerns that certain parts of that program may end. And I think we've really seen a shift at the legislature to recognize that in Vermont, we care about people and we need to ensure that people who don't have housing or need temporary shelter have that shelter. We're going to see a vote on expanding or ensuring that when those programs end on March 15th and on April 1st, people have and maintain housing through the rest of this fiscal year. We are moving in a positive direction at this point.
The Scott administration has focused on the need to fix the regulatory system around housing, arguing that we've put hundreds of millions of dollars into housing development over the last few years, but that money hasn't gone far enough because of our permitting landscape. What does HHAV make of the governor's stance, and what would you like to see lawmakers focus on over the next few months?
We're in this housing crisis, not for one reason, but for many reasons. We're not building enough housing. The cost of construction is skyrocketing. We have a lot of new people who have moved into our state. We have a growing number of short-term rentals. We have a lack of wage growth. All of these issues intersect and combine to create the housing crisis that we currently have. We also need to ensure that folks have wraparound services. Just because you're providing someone with a roof overhead doesn't mean that they are going to be able to stay in that housing if they have health needs that aren't being addressed, if they have substance use needs that aren't being addressed, if there's no local transportation and they can't get to their job. The administration's proposal of just dealing with regulatory reform is highly inadequate in terms of addressing all the other root issues that I'd mentioned earlier.
So from your chair, Frank, how big or small a problem is Act 250 within the whole housing affordability story?
Act 250 reform is something that needs to be addressed, but I think within the entire scheme of needs, it is by far not top of line.
So when it comes to this work, Frank, what keeps you up at night?
A number of issues. We have the immediate crises of we have people who are currently unhoused, and we need to have solutions to that right away. We have freezing temperatures. This is life or death situations for people. Down looking at the pipeline, we need to ensure that the state is investing long term so that we can build the housing needs that we need for our state. That's something we at HHAV are working with our partners on right now, is a long-term visioning process to ensure that we can see, where does Vermont need to be in 10 years, looking at the data? How many houses do we need to have constructed? What does the future of temporary shelter and emergency housing look like? And what do those needs look like in terms of dollar amounts every year in construction? What are the wraparound service needs that are going to be not only today, but 10 years from now, and how do we get there? And so building out year-over-year plans to kind of realize that vision down the road. And so that's something we're really driving toward right now at HHAV.
That was Frank Knack, the inaugural executive director of the Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont, speaking with Vermont Public's Jen Jarecki. Thanks for listening to The Frequency today. We had additional reporting from Adia Golston, Mark Davis, and the New England News Collaborative. Our executive producer is Kevin Trevelyan, and our music is by Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. Talk to you tomorrow.
Every episode of Brave Little State begins with a question about Vermont that's been submitted and voted on by listeners like you. What happened to all the restaurant workers? What's the deal with Vermont's fire towers? Why do people like the band Fish? Follow Brave Little State wherever you get podcasts. From Vermont Public, part of the NPR network.